There's a sound that haunts comedy clubs across America. Not laughter, not applause. It's the echo of a joke landing wrong. The silence that follows when truth cuts too deep. Chris Rock knows that sound better than anyone. March 27, 2022. The Dolby Theater. Millions watching. He makes a joke, then crack a hand across his face. The sound heard around the world. But that slap, that wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy is what nobody saw. A man who spent 60 years learning to turn pain into laughter, discovering that sometimes the laughter stops working. At 60, with $60 million in the bank, 4 Emmys, 3 Grammys, and the respect of an entire generation, Chris Rock sits alone in a 300-square-foot mansion, wondering if anyone ever really heard him, or if they just loved the noise he made to drown out the silence. Before we descend into the shadow behind the laughter, ask yourself what happens to a man who learns that jokes are just another way to hide. The answer will break your heart. February 7, 1965. Andrews, South Carolina. A boy enters the world already marked for invisibility. Chris Rock was the eldest of 7 children. In a house that small, with that many voices, you either learned to be loud or you disappeared. His parents, Julius and Rosalie Rock, fled the South for Brooklyn, chasing the American promise that never keeps its word. What they found? A cramped apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Sirens louder than lullabies. Winters that cut through walls like broken glass. Julius worked as a truck driver and newspaper delivery man, his hands stained with oil and exhaustion. Rosalie taught preschool by day, visited broken homes as a social worker by night. At the dinner table, his father would count coins. Every clink another reminder of how little stood between survival and hunger. "I thought it was normal," Chris would later say. "I thought that's just what life was." But here's what's disturbing about that statement. He didn't just accept poverty. He learned to perform around it. Make them laugh. Make them forget. Make noise, so they don't notice what's missing. Then came age 10. The year everything changed, or rather the year he learned what being black in America really meant. A busing program. Desegregation. Beautiful words that delivered cruel realities. Every morning, young Chris boarded a yellow bus that carried him not just across Brooklyn, but into a world that didn't want him there. He was one of the only black kids in a sea of white faces that greeted him with mockery and fists. Some mornings, he'd recall, "I tied my shoes so tight my fingers hurt, as if the knots could hold me together." Every hallway was a battlefield. Every laugh he heard, that wasn't his own, cut a little deeper. He never told his parents. He carried the bruises like homework, unfinished, unseen. By 13, he'd learned that silence could be safer than truth. But here's the question that defines this entire story. When does protection become prison? When does the shield you build to survive become the wall that keeps everyone out? Chris Rock learned to turn pain into punchlines, humiliation into humor, fear into fire. "I learned to laugh before I learned to breathe," he'd confess decades later in therapy. "Comedy was my way of staying alive." But what happens when the thing that saves you also traps you? What happens when you can't stop performing, even when you're alone? At 18, Chris Rock had nothing. No car, no safety net, no promises waiting. He lived in a room so small the walls whispered when he breathed. The radiator wheezed like an old man fighting for air. Some nights he slept in his jacket, counting cracks on the ceiling just to forget the sound of his stomach. By day he pushed mops through empty diners, the smell of grease clinging to his clothes like a second skin. By night he climbed onto tiny stages in smoky basements that smelled of stale beer and burnt cigarettes. The pay? Almost nothing. Sometimes just a drink, sometimes a few dollars. The humiliation? Free. Some nights the crowd didn't just ignore me. They turned on me, booed, laughed for the wrong reasons. One night the audience walked out one by one, their footsteps echoing through the empty room, the exit sign painting his face red. That echo stayed with me, a new kind of silence, sharper than the one from childhood. There were nights when he didn't go home because home didn't feel like it existed anymore. He'd ride the train until dawn, too broke to afford a room, too proud to admit it. Sometimes he'd later say, "I told jokes to keep from crying. I wasn't trying to be funny. I was trying to stay alive. But here's what's haunting about this chapter. Even when he succeeded, the fear never left. Even when Eddie Murphy walked into that club in 1986 and changed everything. Even when Saturday Night Live came calling in 1990. The boy who'd learned to perform or vanish couldn't stop performing, even when he'd been seen. Because being seen once doesn't erase the terror of becoming invisible again. Bring the Pain. The special that changed comedy forever. The house lights dimmed. Chris's palms were slick. One deep breath. One heartbeat. Then eruption. The crowd roared like thunder meeting confession. The jokes cut deep. The truth sharper. 2 Emmys. Global recognition. The world suddenly calling him the voice of a generation. But here's what nobody talks about. When they call you the best, you stop sleeping, because what if they find out you're not? The late 90s blurred into airports, hotel hallways, endless lights. Bigger and Blacker 1999. Never Scared 2004. The titles sounded fearless, but behind them was a man burning himself to keep the world warm. Hundreds of shows a year. Laughter became oxygen. Applause became habit. Exhaustion became home. Some nights after standing ovations, I'd sit alone under buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at my trembling hands. His body ached. His heart raced. But he smiled because he'd survived another night. Then came the projects that revealed the cracks. Head of State 2003. Budget $35 million. Box office $38 million. Barely broke even. I Think I Love My Wife 2007. Doubled its cost, but critics called it safe. For a man built on truth, being called safe hurt worse than being called broke. Success doesn't protect you from falling. It just makes the fall louder. But the real tragedy wasn't the box office numbers. It was what was happening at home while the world was applauding. New York City. Amid the chaos, he met Malak Compton. She wasn't part of the comedy world. She worked in public relations, calm, composed, steady. In a world built on applause, he'd later say she was silence. And that silence saved me. They married in 1996. No press, no flashbulbs. Just 2 hands and the quiet faith that love could outlast the noise. Their house in Alpine, New Jersey, became his refuge. Mornings, coffee maker hissing, jazz leaking from the kitchen radio, her teasing him for burning toast. When Lola Simone arrived in 2002, something shifted. For the first time, I didn't want to be funny. I just wanted to be there. Then Zara Savannah in 2004. Sundays became sacred. Central Park. No entourage. Just a father pushing strollers through the hum of the city. For a man who'd spent a lifetime being seen, invisibility felt like grace. For a while, everything seemed unbreakable. But success has its own gravity. The higher it pulls you, the harder it is to stay grounded. The tours grew longer. The nights away more frequent. Each standing ovation came with a price. Missed birthdays. Unanswered calls. The slow fading of shared routines. The man who once promised her peace now came home carrying the noise of the world. Sometimes a marriage doesn't break from shouting. He'd later confess. It breaks from silence. It eroded like stone underwater, bit by bit, unnoticed until it was gone. And then came what he called his greatest regret. Infidelity. Not just the betrayal itself, but what it revealed. That he'd built habits of escape. Retreating behind humor whenever real life felt too heavy. I wasn't a good husband, he admitted in his 2018 special Tambourine. That's nobody's fault but mine. Fame can feed your ego until you start mistaking desire for love. December 2014. After nearly 19 years together, they announced their separation. 2016. The divorce finalized. But here's what makes this tragedy so profound. It wasn't scandal. It was understanding arriving too late. By the time he finally learned what love needed, through therapy, through honesty, through brutal self-examination, love had already grown tired. The hardest part, he admitted, is knowing your kids will grow up remembering 2 houses instead of 1. But before the divorce, before the world knew his name, there were other silences. 1988. Chris is 23 years old. His father, Julius Rock, the man who taught him that love is work, who woke before sunrise to deliver newspapers, whose hands were cracked and blackened with oil, goes in for routine ulcer surgery. The call comes like thunder. Julius is gone. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. Chris races to the hospital. Too late. I wanted to scream but no sound came out. I'd made people laugh my whole life, and now when it mattered most, I had no words left. For weeks he can't sleep, haunted by the thought that he hadn't said thank you enough, hadn't made it soon enough for his father to see. When my dad died, part of me died too, but the other part got louder. 2006. His half-brother Charles Liddell Rock dies at 52 from alcoholism. Charles was the older brother who could make him laugh without trying. The quiet one. The one who carried his pain like a secret too heavy to set down. Addiction doesn't just take lives. It steals the chance for one more conversation, one more forgiveness, one more tomorrow. Chris didn't speak about it publicly, but inside everything dimmed. I've seen what happens when men don't talk about their pain. So now I make mine talk for me. December 18, 1997. The call that shattered him. Chris Farley is dead. 33 years old. They'd been brothers at SNL. The Bad Boys. Farley, Rock, Sandler, Spade, Schneider. Farley was the funniest man I ever knew, and maybe the saddest. Behind the roaring laughter, Chris saw a familiar shadow. A man who could silence his pain only by making others forget theirs. You can't joke your way out of pain. You have to face it. August 2008. Bernie Mac dies at 50 from pneumonia complications. The man Chris called his big brother in comedy. The mentor. The monument. At the funeral, Chris's voice trembles. Bernie didn't just make me laugh. He made me proud to be a black comedian. He pauses, swallows hard. We didn't just lose a man. We lost a giant. By 2008, Chris Rock had buried his father, his half-brother, two of his closest friends in comedy. Each loss carved something permanent into him. Grief doesn't fade. It transforms. It becomes empathy. It becomes understanding. March 27, 2022. The Academy Awards. The Dolby Theater shimmers in gold. Chris Rock stands on stage, confident, sharp, in his element. He makes a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith. Then Will Smith rises from his seat, walks toward the stage, each step slow, deliberate, almost unreal. His hand comes down. Crack. The sound silences the world. For a single unbearable second, time itself stops. Chris stands still, stunned but composed. "Wow," he says softly, his voice steady but heavy with shock. He doesn't curse, doesn't retaliate, doesn't break. He does what he's done his entire life. He holds himself together in front of the world. It wasn't weakness, it was discipline, it was grace. But here's what nobody saw. Backstage he stands alone, his hand brushing against his cheek. Not in pain but in disbelief. Sometimes silence says everything words can't. The world erupts, screens flash, headlines scream, opinions multiply. Billions watch the clip over and over. But Chris says nothing. You don't fight fire with fire. You wait until the smoke clears. Then you rebuild. 2023. Netflix. Selective Outrage. The first Live Global comedy special. He turns humiliation into poetry, pain into power. The audience doesn't cheer for jokes. They cheer for grace, for resilience, for dignity. That night at the Oscars will forever be remembered. But not just for the sound that broke the silence. For what came after it. Chris Rock is 60 years old. He owns a 10,300-square-foot estate in Alpine, New Jersey. Net worth $60 million. But he lives quietly now. His days begin with meditation, early walks, gratitude. Lola Simone, 23, is studying abroad in Paris. Zara Savannah, 21, attends USC, pursuing humanitarian work. He calls them every night, shows up for recitals and birthdays. My daughters are the only standing ovations that still matter. In 2020, he was diagnosed with nonverbal learning disorder, NVLD. I used to think I was bad at people. Turns out I'm neurologically bad at people. Therapy has remained a lifelong practice. You don't fix yourself once. You keep learning to listen. His new animated series, Everybody Still Hates Chris, premiered in 2024. His triumphant return as narrator and executive producer. He's developing a new film where he serves as both actor and director. Those close to production describe it as intimate, reflective, fearless. You don't retire from truth. You just find new ways to tell it. But here's the question that haunts this entire story. At what point does laughter stop being art and start being armor? Chris Rock spent 60 years learning to turn pain into comedy, to make the world laugh so they wouldn't see him cry. He buried his father, his brother, his friends. He watched his marriage crumble. He was humiliated in front of billions. And through it all he kept making jokes. Because jokes were how he survived. But survival isn't the same as living. Today in that quiet mansion in New Jersey, something has finally changed. The laughter comes slower now, deeper, more human. There's humor, yes, but underneath a tenderness only loss can teach. Maybe love doesn't end when marriage does, he says. Maybe it just changes form. From promise to responsibility. From passion to peace. He no longer shares a roof with Malak, but he still shares a life with her through the two souls they built together. And when the applause fades, when the crowd goes home, there are still two voices calling from a quiet house. Dad. Perhaps that is the purest kind of redemption. Not the kind that erases what was broken, but the kind that keeps showing up for what still remains. So here we are, at the end of the story. The boy who learned to laugh before he learned to breathe, has finally learned to do both. Not because the pain stopped. It never did. But because he finally understood. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop performing. At 60, Chris Rock doesn't need to make you laugh anymore. He just needs to be heard. If Chris Rock's journey has ever made you laugh, made you think, or made you feel less alone, leave your tribute in the comments. Because his story reminds us, the people who make us laugh the hardest are often carrying the heaviest burdens. Subscribe for more untold stories. Because every comedian has a shadow, and sometimes the shadow is where the truth lives.
That was today's story under the silent spotlight. If you enjoyed uncovering Hollywood's forgotten past, leave a like and subscribe for more vintage tragedies, mysteries, and untold legends. Until next time, keep the reel turning.